preaching group. And Sylvia is a professor of homiletics in Los Angeles at Loy House, which is the school for the Episcopal Diocese of Los Angeles. But she's not only a seminary professor, she spent many years in parish ministry up toward your direction as well, in Montana and Idaho, as well as California. And she's one of our most rounded contributors, I think, who sort of does everything. So Sylvia, we appreciate that. And a perfect example is you will be leading our wrap-up panel this afternoon as well. So Sylvia is going to speak to a topic which I'm sure is already and will very soon be dear to your hearts, because she's going to talk to preaching Holy Week as it comes up. So thank you, Sylvia.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here with everybody and to share a little bit of my experience. I'm going to go ahead and hit share screen, but so I don't forget to. And then we're going to talk a little bit. There we go. There. I've been preaching for over 40 years. And so most of what you see on this PowerPoint and what I'm just going to dump on you is just 40 years worth of life experience with being one putting Holy Week together for people. I do want to say, because I know these are really unique times for the church. And the church is changing significantly. Sometimes it seems from day to day. That's hard emotionally to keep up with, but it's also hard to keep up with in terms of knowing the best of resources that are available in this moment. I know that from this group of deacons and lay leaders, there are deacons who have a very traditional role in their congregation, and traditional meaning really the last 20 years, of being the bridge between the church and the world, and that your role has been to speak on behalf of the poor, the sick, the friendless, and the needy, to invite the community, to lead and direct their resources toward the ministry to those in need, and to invite those in need to find a home within the church, if that be the case. And that sometimes means by attending church, and very often it just means by, and it's not a jest, it means by perceiving that they belong to the church, they belong to God, that they are valued and honored and respected and cared for by people within the church who understand what it means to be a human being created in the likeness of God. So that most of you, maybe many of you for sure, participate in the diaconate in this way. But we're moving into an age where there are also priest shortages happening across the churches. And so some of you are finding that even though you weren't really trained for it, and it wasn't really what you signed on for originally, you're now finding yourself leading small congregations that can't afford to have a paid priest anymore. And so you're in a rather unique position when it comes to things like preaching Holy Week. Then there are also in our midst some lay leaders who not that long ago would have never dreamed that they could be preaching in a church, but our vision has opened to the fullness and the breadth of the ministry of all the baptized in a way that allows us to recognize and celebrate the charisms of people within the community who may not have been ordained, who may never have gone to seminary, but who have gifts to offer. So we're a real hodgepodge of people sharing the screen and hearing the story. And I know you will each hear it from your particular location in the story. But there are some things we can share in common along the way. I just want to remind you of how deep and rich and evocative Holy Week can be in people's lives. Palm Sunday, which is a day that begins Holy Week, and a Palm Sunday really has two pieces. It is the palm part of Palm Sunday and the passion part of Palm Sunday. And one of the things, I'll talk a little bit more about everything when we get here. But one of the things I'll go ahead and say here is it is really important. You know, there are different ideas about whether it's a good idea to have Palm Sunday and Passion Sunday together. And frankly, it doesn't really matter whether we think it's a good idea or not. That's what the church has decided to do, and it comes out of deep tradition and with things that we've seen as early as the 4th century. Tell the story of Egeria being a part of processions in Jerusalem that began with a celebration of the triumphal entry into Jerusalem and end on Golgotha, usually with larger expanses of time and location than what we do in our churches. But there is a long-standing history that puts Palm Sunday and Passion Sunday together. I think one of the things that's really important to remember, though, is it's not a ping pong game. You don't bounce back and forth between Palm and Passion. It's a procession to this momentous event in the life of Christ and in the life of the church. And so if you are preaching, don't preach Palm Sunday in the midst of the telling of the Passion of Christ. It's not really called for in, I checked your rubrics as well as ours. It's not really called for in either of our rubrics, but there are preachers who, because they so want to talk about the triumphal entry and what it meant, and you know, the meaning of that whole experience, they have gone to preaching after the first gospel reading, the Palm Gospel reading. And that is, you know, with the permission of whoever you have to have permission with in your setting, whether that's the priest in charge or whether that's checking in with the bishop or whatever. That is an option to consider, because one of the things it does is it gives you an opportunity to set the stage, but not preempt what's going to happen next and not minimize it. So one tool can be, if you want to preach Palm Sunday, preach it after the Palm Gospel, and then after the Passion Gospel, simply leave time for quiet, for music, for something that allows people to enter much more fully into that Passion narrative. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along, but that's a starting place. Maundy Thursday, full of images, foot washing, Judas's betrayal of Jesus, and Jesus's embrace of all of his disciples, including Judas. Obviously, the Last Supper. Good Friday. The images that you see are meant to invite us much more deeply into the story of the Passion, of the Triduum from Maundy Thursday to Good Friday. I encourage you, as you preach, to think about ways in which you can help to create pictures for people, to help them visualize the events and to see the connection between them and the events, and to see themselves as participants in the events. There is no more important message for us to offer on Holy Week than the story itself. It's not a time when people need to be hearing about us and our lives. As much as I loved what Christian said yesterday and absolutely agree with him, there are times when the preacher should step into the background And the story should absolutely be at the forefront. And I believe Holy Week is one of those times. Holy Week is about Jesus. And that's a very simple thing to say, but it's something that we often need to be reminded of, because we are so grounded in the institutional church that we can very easily move into all kinds of conversations during Holy Week with people about whatever the topic du jour is. But it's meant to be a week where we completely and intentionally focus on the story of Jesus. Do you know this old gospel song? I want to see Jesus. I want to see Jesus, nothing but Jesus. Make this your mantra for Holy Week. How do you help people see Jesus? How do you help people perceive that they are there walking the way of the cross? I talk many times when I'm preaching students about the absolute essentialness that every sermon should engage both head and heart. There needs to be an intellectual, imaginative component to what we do. Anglicans, they love to think. And so there needs to be a thinking element to every sermon that we preach. But there also, and this is where sometimes we fall down, there needs to be something that pulls at our heartstrings, something that allows us to feel more than we feel in front of the TV screen or going about our daily work life. We want people not just to have heard the stories and listened to the stories and remember the stories, but to have taken them into their very being. So if you are preaching Holy Week and it's either all head or I don't know, something else that doesn't touch the heart, then you will have failed the gospel. You will have failed in your mission to bring Holy Week into people's lives and to proclaim the gospel in all its fullness and power and beauty. I do a lot of work with my students on focus statements and function statements. And that's Tom Long's model for how we go about building a good sermon. One of the things that Tom Long says that I just remind you of is every preacher should know exactly why they're preaching the sermon they are preaching on that day. There should be a reason why this is the message that you're choosing to focus on. There should be a reason why you took the tack that you did. And he says the best way to make sure you have gotten clarity about why you chose to preach in the direction you did, or why you are choosing to preach in the direction you want to, is to create a one-sentence statement that says, I am preaching this sermon to. And I'd like to suggest that on Holy Week, you are preaching this sermon to share the good news of Christ's redemptive love. That's it. You are not preaching this sermon to help people understand that sin has taken over our world. You are not preaching this sermon to convince people that they really have to go out and help the poor, sick, friendless, and needy because God will punish them if they don't. You are not preaching this sermon to moralize. You are not preaching this sermon to do any of the other things you may be tempted to do that week. You're preaching this sermon to share the good news of Christ's redemptive love. And that redemptive love should ring loud and true in whatever stories, whatever you tell, whatever way you frame the gospel for the day. In Holy Week, Jesus is the focal point of our preaching. And one of the important questions we need to ask ourselves is, can we pray in a way that's not all about me? Because frankly, can we preach in a way that's not all about me? Way too frequently, what we're doing in church gets to be all about us. And really, even more, all about me. I've been a part of a community before where all of the music that was done was about me and Jesus and how Jesus has redeemed me and what a sinner I was and how now I have been saved. And there is no point in that story where it becomes clear that Christ came to redeem the world. It's as if Christ only came for the people in the room. That is not the message of Holy Week. That is not the message of the Passion. And so when we're thinking about how we're going to preach Holy Week, we need to ask, what is it about for the world? How big is this salvation? How far does it reach? Because of all of the time constraints that go with so much of what we do, you need to be brief, you need to be sincere, you need to be vulnerable without making it all about you. And you need to be compassionate because you model for people in the way you preach that week who Christ is. There are certain dangers in preaching Holy Week. The big one is anti-Semitism and supersessionism. And if you have not done any reading in this area, this is, I'd said in the beginning, the church has moved and changed. And this is one of the places where, thank God, we have changed, at least in our language and our understanding in a way that is vitally important. We have so much more clarity now, I think, at least at an intellectual level, about the dangers and the atrocity in itself of teaching hate through our engagement with the gospel. And way back, the first presentation you heard from Stephen, which seems like a long time ago. Now, you remember he talked a little about this and how important it was that we not allow John's voice, the Johannine Gospel's voice, to become a tool for anti-Semitic thought or inclination even. Part of that is really understanding at a level that perhaps we didn't allow ourselves, and we didn't want to. We have been, for much of the history of the church, supersessionists. We really have taught people to believe that the real religion was Christianity and Judaism was the precursor that failed. And that is not a true and fair reading of the whole gospel message. And so one of if you don't hear anything else from me today, hear that we cannot be about the business of either blatantly or subtly encouraging hatred within either our community or our society by using the gospel as a weapon against Jews. That couldn't possibly be more important than it is right now when we're living in a time where anti-Semitism is so very, very intense and so high. One of the principles that we really have to wrap our own heads around, we have to have done our own constructive theology about, is understanding the relationship between Judaism and Christianity, and that one does not supersede the other. They run on parallel tracks, and that we can trust God as we do so much more readily, I think, with Buddhists or Hindus or Jains or many other religions of the world. We can trust God to find ways to use the depths of wisdom within that tradition to give people relationship with God. And when we are going through the Gospels, and what is called for is the reading of the Johannine Passion, then we have multiple choices. One choice is to read it as it is and let the chips fall where they may. We should know now, after the last several years, and certainly the last century of the church's life and the world's life, we should know that there will be people that will blame the Jews for killing Jesus, and there will be people who will use that language to instill hatred. We don't want to be those people. An option that is being presented very frequently now is that we not use the Johannine Passion. That in the situations where that has been called for by our elections, that we that we make a different choice. And I encourage you to consider going that route. Everything in Scripture is there for our use, and everything is not adequately there for our use in worship. Worship puts constraints on conversation that can't be overcome. And so the choice to use a text that is volatile in some way, in a setting where there can be no give and take, no back and forth, no unpacking, is really, really problematic. The third option that we're beginning to see more and more, and I didn't put a citation for this in what I did, but is some totally appropriate and reasonable translation decisions that change the language so that we're not talking about the Jews as a particular religious group. We are talking about the Jews. We're using a different language to talk about the Jewish community as a group of people of a particular time and setting. And one of the people who does a really nice job of that is Wilda Gaffney in her new Women's Lectionary for the Whole Church. She uses the language that is being encouraged by those like Dan Jocelyn Simakowski, who are scholars of Scripture and how to best utilize it without promoting anti-Semitism. She uses the term Judeans in the places where it says Jews. That helps to take some of the starch out of those people who believe that this is about one religion being pitted against another. So one of the big dangers, the biggest danger, anti-Semitism and supersessionism. We can't ever forget for a moment that our salvation was brought to us by a devout Jew. Another danger is we need to be aware of weighting things in a way that diminishes the power and the pathos of the Christ event. Drawing analogies or using metaphors that devalue the central story of our lives. When one chooses to tell a long personal story about something that happened to you as your introduction into a conversation about the Passion, then the focus is moved to a place that's not appropriate for the day. And sometimes we will use analogies that people go, wait, you're comparing your pet chicken dying to Jesus on the cross? So being absolutely conscious of the need for whatever illustrations we choose to make, if we choose to make them, to bear the kind of weight and gravitas that's required by the moment, by the part of the story we're in. I want to say just a word here about anamnesis and what it is. Many of you will have, over the course of your preparations, heard about anamnesis, particularly within the context of the Eucharist. Anamnesis is holy remembering, sacred remembering. It's a kind of remembering that draws us into the story and fills the story with life. It is not simply, oh, I need to remember to pick up milk at the grocery store. It's a very different memory process that invites us into the fullness of all that event is about, that invites us to see, hear, smell, taste, as if we were in the room ourselves, as if we were in that moment. And if Holy Week is about anything, it's about anamnesis. And so finding ways to help people remember the story with themselves in it is the work that was begun easily in the 4th century, in some pieces even a little earlier, by early Christians who didn't just want to hear the story of the Passover and Passion of Jesus. They wanted to live into it. That's what we're trying to do as well. Holy Week offers us the fulcrum upon which the life of the church balances. You all know, I'm sure, that we began with the celebration of the resurrection on every Sunday. That was the first gatherings of Christian people. But very quickly in the story, the church began also, and partly because there was still engagement with the synagogue. Passover was being celebrated by the Christian community in their participation in the synagogue life still. And very quickly, the need to commemorate the Passover with its depth of meaning for Christians now as the Passover of Christ from death into life, the sacred lamb that was slain, all of those pieces of the story, that fulcrum was the beginning place for everything that developed within the liturgical year and the liturgical life of the church. So that week is about commemorating Easter from its beginnings on Palm Sunday to its ending on Easter Sunday with the resurrection. And we are about making that work happen. Palm Sunday is the Passion previewed. And our question I think it's really important for people to think about is, are you going to get people back on Monday, Thursday, or Good Friday, or Holy Saturday? But particularly, I would say, are you going to see them again on Good Friday? I don't know what your experience is. I know people tend to think that Californians are by nature heathens, even when they go to church. But but that's not actually the reality around here. But I will tell you that I know from many years that people don't make it on Good Friday anymore. And if you're in one of those wonderful, beautiful places where the community does still keep gathering during Holy Week, what a blessing. There is so much life that can come from that experience. But if reality for you is that you know that 10% or less of your congregation will be back on Good Friday to hear the Passion, then you need to be pretty conscious about the fact that for people to get to Easter Sunday, the only Passion they're going to hear is what they hear Palm Sunday. And to plan accordingly as you put together what you're going to preach that week and where you're going to preach it. So preaching in one way or another, emphasizing, highlighting, really deeply illuminating the Passion story on Palm Sunday becomes critical in most of our churches at this point. It is very, very difficult to successfully preach a good sermon about the Passion after you've read the Passion. I have known really fine preachers who have done it. It's not easy work, and part of it is because that story carries so much power in and of itself. What can you say afterward? And so thinking about how to successfully preach that day ends up, it's going to take time. It's going to take a commitment to helping people enter more fully, not less fully, into the event. The last thing we want to do in our preaching on Palm Sunday is short circuit the emotional process people have entered into by hearing the Passion reading. And that's also why it's so important that it be read well. Many, many places do multi-part reading for that day because one voice reading the entire Passion narrative does not do it justice. This is the Palm Sunday reading. Yeah, I want you to see how long it is for one thing. This year will take us through Mark 14:1 to 15:47. Of course, each of the readings for different years has a different emphasis from different Gospels. This one's actually one of the shorter ones, but it is still outrageously long. And making the decision about what to preach on in the midst of all this gets to be, it's going to take time to think through that. And there's always the question of where's the spiritual entity of the community that you're a part of right now? What part of the story do they most need to encounter this year? So I'm not, for the sake of time, going to read us through all of Mark for Palm Sunday. But I would say to you, it's not at all too early for you to just sit down with the lessons for Holy Week and let them enter your heart so that you can begin to consider what directions you might want to take with them. Monday, Thursday is whether you're talking about, depending on your gospel, whether you're talking about foot washing or you're talking about the institution of the Eucharist, it is the day we talk about beloved community. And this one we are going to read for two reasons. Oops, I went too far. Often, very, very often, when a deacon is preaching in a congregation that also has a priest, the preaching on Maundy Thursday falls to the deacon for fairly obvious reasons as we read through it. So is there, well, I don't know if I'll be able to see you. Betty, you are up on my screen right now. You're the one I can see. Would you be willing to read this John passage? Is it big enough for you to be able to see?
Yes, yes. I just, yeah, it's fine. I just have to move us. Let me just, sorry. There. Okay. Do you want me to read it now?
Please.
The Holy Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ according to John. Now, before the festival of the Passover, Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart from this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The devil had already put it into the heart of Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, to betray him. And during supper, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going to God, got up from the table, took off his outer robe, and tied a towel around himself. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was tied around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said, Lord, are you going to wash my feet? Jesus answered, You do not know now what I am doing, but later you will understand. Peter said to him, You will never wash my feet. Jesus answered, Unless I wash you, you have no share with me. Simon Peter said to him, Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head. Jesus said to him, One who has bathed does not need to wash except for the feet, but is entirely clean. And you are clean, though not all of you. For he knew who was to betray him. For this reason he said, Not all of you are clean. After he had washed their feet and had put on his robe and had returned to the table, he said to them, Do you know what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for that is what I am. So if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have set you an example that you also should do as I have done to you. Very truly I tell you, servants are not greater than their master, nor are messengers greater than the one who sent them. If you know these things, you are blessed if you do glorify him. I was not sorry, I lost my place. Now the Son of Man has been glorified, and God has been glorified in him. If God has been glorified him, God will also glorify him in himself and will glorify him at once. Little children, I am with you only a little longer. You will look for me. And I said to the Jews, so now I say to you, where I am going, you cannot come. I will give you a new commandment, that you love one another just as I have loved you. You also should love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. The Gospel of Christ.
Praise to you, Lord Christ. Yes. This is one of the short readings of the week. And it is so packed. There are so many directions that you can take. And one of the things I want to say to you just in this moment, I'm not sure if we're going to have time. If we have time, I'm going to send you off to your groups to talk about this a little bit. But as the deacon in the congregation, what parts of this reading do you think speak to the heart of a deacon? What parts of this reading can you most fully embrace and share in a way that will help those within your community understand what this gospel means in the world we're in now. You remember what Micah said yesterday about there's the what, the so what, and the now what. What's the now what that you want to present to a community if you are the preacher on Maundy Thursday? And you notice this year, it's John, and so there is not the emphasis on the Eucharist that there is some other years, when one of the other readings is used for Maundy Thursday. So what does that mean? Where do you want to go? And at the same time, every Maundy Thursday is an opportunity for us to celebrate and commemorate all that it means to be the beloved community. So if we have time, I'm going to send you to your groups to discuss what you're going to do with Maundy Thursday if you're the preacher, but I want to get through the rest of this first and then just see if we have time or not. Good Friday. The question people are asking themselves: who killed Jesus? And it is vitally important that you help them understand who it was and who it wasn't. One of the advantages of putting ourselves into the story is it becomes apparent to us quickly that we are as likely as anybody else to have been the ones proclaiming crucify him, crucify him. And presenting that message in a way that makes it vitally clear there's not an evil community that did that. That story tells us about so much of our human nature, no matter who we are. So I invite you within your own self to develop a deep clarity about what Good Friday was about, why Jesus died, who killed Jesus, how much a part of the story power and privilege and the empire was in that story. And whatever you do or preach or create for Good Friday observances, do no harm. Don't undo Jesus's life by making the day of ultimate love be a day of hate. This is the reading for Good Friday. Again, if people come back, they have a wonderful experience of hearing this story. This is the John reading that I've included in here. I've included the one that is called for by your prayer book. I really was hoping to be able to reach out to Eileen Scully and see, I'm sure there are new Canadian resources to deal with Holy Week and issues around anti-Semitism, but I wasn't able to find them on my own. Some of you may be more aware of those and be able to put in the chat or somewhere how we can access those. And I'm waiting to hear back from Eileen, who's in Korea right now, and we can let you all know what resources she has been a part of creating for the Anglican Church in Canada in regard to this issue. Stay in the pathos of the story and don't dilute it. In many ways, the only real question for the day is, were you there? Were you there at the crucifixion? And what was it like to be a part of that horrendous event? And what was Jesus doing? There's a whole lot of constructive theology that is essential to preaching, especially during the major feasts. In other words, we have to know within ourselves, not just what we've been taught by some professor somewhere or read in a book, but what we have claimed within ourselves as the truth of the gospel. That has to be deeply implanted in us before we can preach it. And so I really encourage you in these weeks leading up to Holy Week, if you need to do more work around that, if your life has moved and the answers that you were given along the way are not working for you, come to answers that do work. Do more reading. One voice, a wonderful voice that is helping Christians at this point, is the voice, and Stephen referenced this a little bit on the first night as well, of Amy Jill Levine, who is a rabbi, a Jewish rabbi, who has written extensively about the Gospels, who looks at the Gospels from a Jewish perspective and offers that perspective to Christians. So I encourage you to consider adding her books to your library. If what you have been taught or what you are teaching about, particularly Good Friday, but not just Good Friday, doesn't carry the whole message for you anymore. And I think it's really important, to remind you that substitutionary atonement is only one of the many ways of understanding atonement, and that when that is preached in this day and age, there will be as many people or more, probably more at this point, who don't believe it as who do. It is not the only atonement theory that we have been given by the church, even from the earliest days of the church. And so one of the questions we have to ask ourselves is, if Jesus's death is not about some kind of sacrifice paid to God to pay for our sins, did atonement happen? What was the purpose of his death? And are there different kinds of atonement that we can help our community understand that will make sense out of their own lives? How does forgiveness come to our lives? And what did Jesus do that helped make forgiveness of the world, of all of creation, possible? What did Jesus accomplish on Good Friday? And how do our lives parallel his? Or do they? Is there something about the choices he made that can inform the choices we make for our lives? Holy Saturday. Always about baptism. That is what the vigil is about. It is about preparing people to enter into the sacred community of the faith. It is one of the great gifts that we have, and it is the beginning of the Easter celebration. Baptism is about being raised to new life in Christ, hearing the whole salvation story in the context of the history of the earth, and also the context of human history. And then one of the important questions for us now in this time period, in this day, is Scripture tells us that this is about the salvation of all of creation, the redemption of all of creation. How do we communicate that in a way that doesn't just make it about the humans in the story, that gives it a greater and larger frame from which we can perceive it? And then, oops. Then we have the Gospel according to John as one of the Easter readings. And Easter Sunday morning, we'll hear the Mark Gospel, which we should also hear too, because if you are one of those people in a congregation where you are the solo clergy person and you are going to preach on Easter Sunday and you're going to preach Mark, in many ways, I think Mark is one of the hardest of the Easter lessons to preach because it doesn't do what we want it to do. And so I want us to hear it and you to have a chance to think about what you would do with this. And many people just don't. They just do a different reading. But if you're in a place where there's a commitment to staying within the lections, that would be helpful. And Ken, you're on my screen right now. So can you read the Gospel of Mark according to for Mark for us?
The Holy Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ according to Mark. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James and Salome brought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. The Gospel of Christ.
Darn, huh? What do you do with that ending? And I think one of the things you do is you don't lose the headline for the sake of the ending. The message of resurrection is loud and clear and full of punch in this gospel. This is the place that Mark has been taking us to. The moment of promise of resurrection is clear. And so don't allow the need to figure out what to do with these women who didn't say anything, according to this passage, to outshine the reality of the message that was given by the angel. That's the real message of the day. And you know, I frankly, my temptation would be to just, if people need to ask you at the door on the way out, how come those women didn't say anything? Then you say, well, that's a great conversation we should have sometime. And you find a way to have that conversation and to talk more about Mark. But you don't stop at the beginning of the gospel for Easter Sunday and say, let me explain to you a little bit about Mark and the parameters of Mark and the way in which secrecy was such a significant piece of what he was doing and how he was trying to. You're watering down your own gospel if you stop and do all of that at this point. Heart should lead, not head. So I guess that would be the one piece I would say to you right now as you get ready potentially to preach this Mark gospel. Hallelujah, Christ is risen. That is the message of Easter. Are there, oops, where'd I go? Are there questions from anybody? And I would say, let's see if I can get things to come up. So let me stop share. There we are, we're back. Okay. If there are questions and you want to put them in the chat, that would be just fine. Let me go back and see if there's some that came up. Okay, great. And thank you to Lisa Chisholm Smith, who put in, here's a new Canadian resource published by the United Church related to anti-Semitism. And so you may want to pull up that, that link and add that to your resources. Amy Jill Levine, Witness at the Cross, works well as a Lent study in parishes. And yes, Ken, I encourage people to do some of this work in Lenten programs before you get to Easter. It's an incredibly important topic right now, and a great topic. Too late for this Lent for most everybody, but next Lent will be here before we know it. I'm curious whether people have participated in or planned a Holy Saturday liturgy for the Saturday itself, not the vigil. I'm very interested in that part of the story, the waiting, the black box of the tomb, not being able to see what's happening, not knowing what will happen, either as the one in the tomb or someone waiting outside of it. So that's an interesting question, Tracy. And is there anybody who has done really this? You're talking about a vigil, a Friday night to Saturday evening vigil.
Hi. My
Yeah,
name's Young. I use the lament psalms on Holy Saturday that we strip our church on Thursday and unstrip it on Saturday. We don't do Saturday night thing, and we use the lament psalms starting and ending with Psalm 22 as the quiet time, and neither nor is what we call it.
And what's people's experience of that? What do they, how do they participate, and what do they say about that experience?
Well, the lineup goes down around the corner and all the way to the Walmart store, but there's not many who come. It's mostly those of us who are geeks on Psalms, just a few of us, and the church is very quiet and bare. And for those of us who are there, it's pretty cool. But it's not something, and some people come once and really hate it because lament psalms are not easy,
Right.
and there's no unbearing of the lament psalms. They are, there's no trying to ease it.
Right. Yeah. Teaching people how to lament is one of the important things we need to do as pastors, I think coming at that from a diaconal perspective is a really interesting idea. What does it mean as a deacon to teach your community how to lament so that they can open their hearts more fully to the suffering that they're then asked to respond to? And that might be an interesting piece to play with sometime in your Holy Saturday. Yeah. Bonnie asked, do we tone down our voice and emphasis in body language?
Well, they could.
I don't ever tone down my voice and emphasis in body language. We want people to be able to feel along with us. And that requires of us a level of transparency and passion and engagement and care that really, it needs to be unbridled that week. And I don't mean that to say that we become the center of attention. It's quite the opposite. The message becomes the center of attention, and we allow our own emotion, our own passion for this event to help carry people to a place they're not sure they have permission to go to. And maybe it hasn't been their life story to see this as their story in the way that the church invites us to. So I can't think of a time during Holy Week when you tone down, but it's all done with an incredible level of intentionality about why we say and do the things we do, and where the spotlight is shining constantly in that process.
Sylvia, could we do one more question if there is one, and then come to a close?
Absolutely. I was just looking at the clock, seeing I've got 1 minute left.
That's right.
There's not another question on the screen, but there might be. If you can hold up your hand if you have a question, we'll do one last question, and then we'll take our break. we might be done because I'm not seeing any more hands coming up.
Okay.
Okay.
Sylvia, thank you so much. You are so clear on these issues. I love the clarity of your suggestions for us. It really, especially on a very difficult topic, it's got to be incredibly helpful. And I want everybody to know, I think you already know, that these sessions are being recorded, and about 48 hours after now, you will be able to go back and relive each of these presentations, including Sylvia's.